Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. One piece of feedback that I get from people a lot in personality development conversations is, what do I do when I've already developed my auxiliary function or my co-pilot? It's all developed, so now it's time for me to move on. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts. It can be the situation. A person has done a lot of growth and development work and they've focused on their auxiliary function and they're ready to move on. In previous podcasts, we've talked about one of the things that happens after you've developed your auxiliary or co-pilot function is that you move on to a tension between your auxiliary and your tertiary, your co-pilot and your 10-year-old. And then you have a dance between those two functions that needs to be mastered. And then eventually, or even simultaneously, your inferior or 3-year-old function pops up and it needs some attention as well. And I think we record that podcast probably not even 10 podcasts ago.
And if you're a new listener, you just stumbled upon us somewhere, or maybe you're not familiar with the episodes we're talking about, we're going to reference something called the CAR model in this show today. Be good to go over to our website, look up the CAR model. There's a podcast and some articles about that to give you a framework for what we're talking about. And also understand that when we talk about personality types, we don't just talk about them as the system, like the Myers-Briggs system in itself. We always try to weave in with the system a way to apply it to personal growth in our lives. So we're coming from a personal growth framework.
All right, Joel's prerequisite to all new listeners. All right, so for those of you that are not new listeners and are with us and have been listening to us for a while, I'm going to launch right back into the conversation around what do you do when you feel like you have your auxiliary function handled. Well, actually, that's not what we're talking about. That's what we've already talked about. What I actually and Joel want to talk about today is why our auxiliary function can never actually be fully let go of when it comes to personality development. As in, you may have developed it to a certain point, which is good and positive, but it is a tricky thing because if you look at it through the lens of the firm model, which of course we've done podcasts on as well and have mentioned it in our book, so please go look up firm model if this is the first time you've ever heard about it. But our type's firm model fixation and our auxiliary function are actually locked in an eternal battle with each other. And that means that we can very much trick ourselves into believing that we are complete or we have done sufficient auxiliary function development. But that's just our firm fixation trying to trick us into believing that we don't have any more work to do because it actually wants to get kind of as far away from that function as it possibly can. So in today's podcast, we're going to talk about the relationship between those two things, our firm model fixation and its antithesis or sort of its antagonism. Ambivalence actually might be the best word. Our firm fixation's ambivalent relationship to our auxiliary or co-pilot function. And one of the things that we can be keeping our finger on the pulse of as we are not just developing that function, but also maintaining it and looking for opportunities to continue developing it, even if we believe we have it up to a baseline.
Just as a quick guide, the firm model is an acronym, FIRM. F stands for freedom, which is the fixation of all EP types. I stands for invulnerability, which is the fixation for all IJ types. R stands for rightness, which is the fixation for all IP types. And M stands for management, which is the fixation for all EJ types.
As we go through this podcast, we'll take each of these types or fixations in order and then address the appropriate cognitive functions for the people that fit within that fixation. So let's start with that freedom. That would be all EPs in the Myers-Briggs system, ENFPs, ENTPs, ESTPs, and ESFPs. So for all EPs, their auxiliary function is going to be, for EFPs, it's going to be introverted feeling or authenticity. And for ETPs, it's going to be introverted thinking or accuracy. So what is the ambivalent relationship that freedom or a freedom fixation has with introverted thinking or introverted feeling? Well, a freedom fixation basically is being fixated on wanting to have all of your possibilities and options open at any time and being able to spontaneously move in any direction you want to move in. That means you get to do whatever you want to whenever you want to. And there's a fixation EPs have on this ideal of being able to just do whatever they want to as the inspiration strikes them. So why does introverted thinking or accuracy limit that freedom fixation? And why does introverted feeling or authenticity limit that freedom fixation?
Well, when you are beginning to grow your co-pilot of one of those introverted judging processes, you have to start making decisions and create a priority list, basically, of the things that mean something to you. Either they make sense to you or they resonate deeply with you authentically, and you start to prioritize some things over other things. And by definition, every time you say yes to something that's important, it's saying no to a bunch of other things. So the options are now removed from the table, the metaphorical table of your life. You don't have as many options as you start to make meaningful decisions about things that matter to you.
Yeah, introverted judging functions could also be called personal accountability. Like you're not necessarily accountable to things outside of yourself, which is what EPs always fear, is that they're going to be like trapped or stuck. But it does create a personal accountability, because introverted thinking, as it, for ETPs, as it gets more sophisticated and moves on, eventually gets to a place where it can't separate itself from integrity. It must be in integrity and in alignment with the things that make sense to it. And that means things like duty and requiring intellectual honesty. You're trying to root out cognitive dissonance. Well, nothing creates cognitive dissonance more than behaving in a way that contradicts what is meaningful to you as a person. And so as you develop introverted thinking or accuracy, integrity, duty, keep watching yourself for any moment of lying to yourself or lying to others, this is by definition going to limit the things that you're able to do. You're not going to behave or be able to behave in a way that goes against what your personal sense of ethics that is born from your introverted thinking requires of you.
In the same vein, when you use introverted feeling, what's authentic to you, the core values of your life will be guiding you, and you're going to have certain things you stand for that are authentic to who you are. And by moving toward those things, having importance there, you're going to do meaningful things. You're not going to just waste. I see so many EFPs wasting their time in their life just chasing shiny objects all the time. And they never get a groove of what's meaningful to them. And the ones that do are unstoppable. So it's that tension point between the two, that introverted feeling part. What are your core values? What's driving you? What matters to you? What do you care about? These are the things I think that really speak to that. They're in conflict with that EP firm fixation of freedom. And when you get there, it is freeing, I think, for both EP types, ETPs and EFPs. When you have that duty, when you have that allegiance to your core values, I think there is a freedom there because you know what you're supposed to be doing. It's a clarity that comes. And
it's freedom from all the things that trap you in a meaningless life. Like a meaningless life, or a life that is not on a path, is actually, you can see this, that when people bounce around from thing to thing, the number one evidence of this, unless they come from money, is that you just can't generate any resource, right? There's no traction. You can't get any traction in your life. And so what ends up binding you isn't your lack of freedom of motion. What ends up binding you is your lack of resource and your lack of ability to make things happen. And so you're just as stuck. You're just stuck in a different way. And I think we've talked about that in previous podcasts around the firm fixation. So one of the things that I think an EP really needs to be, pretty self-aware around is that you're going to kind of shy away, even if you've done a lot of development in your auxiliary function or copilot function, you're going to shy away from the more fine-grained elements of this. As a person who's an ETP myself, using introverted thinking or accuracy, I've done a lot of work and development around this. I've studied formal logic, I've studied philosophy, I've really gone in and looked at the programming of my mind and done a lot of work around making sure that I'm, doing perpetually watching my own programming and trying to figure out whether or not that's good programming or bad programming. And there is a part of me that still wants to be able to be intellectually dishonest if it suits me. There's a part of me that wants to be able to say, rage at you, Joel, and get really mad and pretend like I'm the victim in a situation and, behave as if like everybody's out to get me, even though I know that this is my own baggage that I'm bringing to the world. And so the work of my auxiliary function is never done. It's never over. I still need to make sure that I'm being intellectually honest. And especially with the new information that I bring in, one of the things I'm trying to really focus on is carefulness. It's very easy for me to pretend as if I have taken in and considered enough information to be able to make a reply back when I believe somebody else is very wrong about their worldview. And I think one of the things I'm now reminding myself on a regular basis is that I might not have all the information. I might need to be more thoughtful about this and really think about it when it comes to battling out my ideas and concepts with other people. So there's always work to be done there. It's not the lion's share of my current work, and yet I still need to acknowledge that I'm not done when it comes to that, because there's a part of me that is going to naturally resist it. There's a part of me that's going to resist having to choose a specific path. The more introverted thinking or accuracy work I do, the more I get clear on what path I want to carve out. And if I want to keep all my options open, it means that I might, on an unconscious level, keep myself in an unclear place. It might mean that I trick myself into believing that I'm not sure what my path is and ignore opportunities and messages that are the ones that bring me clarity, because now it's going to keep me on a specific path and now my options are closed. So it's that these two parts of who I am, and the pattern holds true for all types. There's going to be even fine-grained things that will make the fixation resist the more nuanced work of the auxiliary. So it's important to keep your finger on the pulse of that.
I think one thing that can help EPs is a sense of time, which we all struggle with. If you're an EP, a sense of timelines and timing, you feel like you have forever. So you can keep your options open indefinitely because it almost feels like you have an indefinite amount of time. And the more aware you are of a ticking clock of your life, I think that helps point you down here to go, okay, I've got to make some decisions about what matters to me, because time will eventually run out. It's not an endless resource like most other things. And that's something I think can really help EPs to understand. I've got to get a handle on this tension point between my firm fixation of freedom and making decisions about what's important to me. And once timeline comes into it, I think that starts to give us a real clear picture of, okay, I got to get stepping on this thing.
Don't get too anxious about time so that you rush to your tertiary or 10-year-old function of extroverted feeling for ETPs or extroverted thinking for EFPs. Don't feel like you have to get into action and just start behaving. It's okay to spend time in that auxiliary or co-pilot to really get a sense of the calibration of the direction of what's important to you. And if you're just there all the time, if it's less about developing a direction than it is about just always perpetually keeping your options open, that is staying too much in your dominant or driver function, and you will lose a sense of time. And for a little bit more information on each type's relationship to time, we recorded a podcast that we called Cognitive Functions in Time, which give us a little bit of insight into how we can each individually create a better relationship to time.
So let's swing over to the IJs in the firm model. Now this is the invulnerability fixation for IJs. So these are INFJs, INTJs, ISFJs, and ISTJs. And the conflict here between the fixation of invulnerability and growing the co-pilot, all IJs have an extroverted judging co-pilot. So either extroverted thinking for the ITJs or extroverted feeling for the IFJs. Extroverted thinking we've nicknamed effectiveness, extroverted feeling we've nicknamed harmony. And when you as an IJ get into your extroverted judging function, you now put yourself out there in the world, quote unquote, and it makes you very vulnerable to feedback. You get the metrics back on the effectiveness or extroverted thinking level. Did this work? Did this not work? What do the numbers look like? Either real numbers or metaphorical numbers. And from extroverted feeling, you get people's feedback. You get the response from people to emotionally let you know, are you calibrated, doing the right thing, the wrong thing? You know, are you in alignment and connection with the group? So you get this feedback now from the outer world, and that makes you vulnerable to the crowd. That makes you vulnerable to the world. You no longer are as in much control as you would have been had you just stayed internal the entire time.
I think vulnerability comes in here. When we talk about invulnerability for IJs, it can sound like we're just talking about being protective of, I don't know, like you're talking about feedback from the world or like people's impression of you. But I think that this can also have to do with energy, because IJs are some of the most protective of their energy. And when you are developing that auxiliary or co-pilot of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, this is a function that requires you to go expend energy to set up systems so that you can get those metrics back, so you can see whether or not what you're doing works. And I think there's a little bit of fear that more work begets work, meaning if you start putting things out in the world, does that mean, or trying to make goals happen or finishing projects or implementing projects, does that mean that you're going to get yourself put in a system of having to continue to do? And is that going to require energy of you that you don't know that you have to expend? For extroverted feeling harmony, for the IFJs, this can be more like, well, that means that I'm going to have to enter these relationships. I'm going to end up, creating dynamics of people who have expectations of me now. And what if we end up in a position of conflict? And now I'm going to have to work through this conflict in order to create harmony. And will I have the energy to be able to do all of that?
So when we talked about the EPs, the resistance to growing the co-pilot is this idea of accountability to your core values or what makes sense to you. For IJs, it's this resistance to the expectations you're going to create in the outer world for yourself, that now you're going to have to generate that energy to fulfill those expectations that you've just set up for yourself. So it's accountability for EPs and expectations for IJs. And just like when an EP goes to their co-pilot of introverted feeling or introverted thinking, sometimes it can feel like that's in conflict with that firm model fixation of freedom. And true freedom comes in knowing what you're here to do, what matters to you, and it kind of you're a slave as an EP to not having yourself locked down in a way. The paradox of choice. You're a slave to all these choices in front of you. Well, similar to IJs, when you start to create in the world, you execute on things either through extroverted thinking effectiveness or extroverted feeling harmony. You now are creating things outside yourself that can be self-generating for your energy. Right now, if you're an IJ and you're worried, oh man, I'm going to create all these expectations outside myself. Well, that is true. You will. And also, you'll be creating systems outside yourself to help manage those expectations. So all of that energy will not have to come from within, because that's your fear, right? Oh man, do I have what it takes inside of me to generate this energy? Well, if you're doing this well, you're going to create relationship systems or physical systems in the outer world that will pour energy into you to help you keep going. So counterintuitively, the resistance to building those systems, you feel like the solution is not to do that. And we would argue that the solution is to do those things because it actually can help you with that energy management.
There's nothing that generates a feeling of vulnerability more for most people than to be caught unprepared. And I think IJs understand this more than most because there's this sense of always being in preparation mode before they execute. That measure twice, cut once thing is very much an IJ mentality. And so there's a lot of preparation that IJs naturally do before they implement. That said, one of the best ways to not be caught unprepared is to already be implementing those systems, to create systems that make it so that you're not unprepared because you've already, quote unquote, built the castle in the moat. If you're always in the blueprint phase, you can trick yourself into believing that you're preparing, and then once you execute, there's going to be this completely, this whole beautiful, elegant structure that will make sure that you're never vulnerable ever. But there's nothing more vulnerable than, you're protecting blueprints at that point. You're not protecting a castle, so to speak. So actually being an implementation and exposing yourself, quote unquote, to energy, the things that require energy from you, from expectations, but also putting out to the world the things that you believe are important, right? Because that's what an extroverted judging function does, is it judges how things should be set up in the outside world, which does expose you to other people's opinions. And you might have some conflict there, and you might have some things that you have to, quote unquote, rub up against and try to, figure and maneuver around. And also, that's how you build your structures. That's how you build your systems and your networks, whether they be human or whether or not they be, like more sort of thinking type of systems. Regardless of which one that you're focused on, those things end up creating protections for you as well. It's not just preparedness, but it's actually protection through these different layers of systems that you've built in the outside world. And as you mentioned, Joel, a lot of those can be built to be generative. They can be built to actually manage energy much better than sitting around and then being in a situation of quote unquote attack and not having anything to protect yourself with. If you've got these systems set up already, then in those moments of attack, because we all experience moments of attack in the world, in those moments of attack, you've built so many structures around you so that you don't have to outlay an insane amount of energy in those moments, so that you're okay. So I guess that's a very abstract way of saying, if you're sitting around doing nothing, yeah, sure, you're protecting your energy, but what happens in a moment of calamity? You've got nothing to help you out. So then the outlay of energy in a moment of calamity is crushing. If you are willing to outlay energy and build things in the outside world as you're going, while it's more energy up front, when a moment of calamity strikes, then the outpouring of energy feels similar to what you've already acclimated to in a day-to-day life. It's like you're already sort of used to this level of energy output, and so it doesn't crush you. So there's a seeming contradiction between the firm fixation of invulnerability and exposure to outer world feedback and the word you used, Joel, which was expectation. There seems to be an incongruity between those two things. But just like with the EPs, if you do it well and do it right, and you continue to build those systems and get better and better and better at building them, then you actually make yourself less vulnerable because you have more systems set up to protect you in those moments.
Because the reality is there's already expectations. I mean, the reality is we don't go through the world without expectations put upon us. So all you're doing is formalizing it, and you're setting up systems to accommodate it because you can't get away from those expectations anyway. Let's kick over to the R in firm for rightness, which are all the IPs. So INFPs, INTPs, ISFPs, and ISTPs in the Myers-Briggs system are fixated upon being right, basically. It's the idea that if I'm right, if I know this to be true or this to be resonant, that gives me a sense of sureness through the world. I don't feel so unsure of myself. I have a sense of sureness, and I have a sense of being able to move through the world because IPs all struggle with executing in the outer world because the inferior 3-year-old process is extroverted feeling, extroverted thinking. It's sometimes hard to either understand relationships outside of yourself or structures outside yourself. So you come back to the center point of the self, saying, I'm right in this, and this helps me navigate through the world.
Well, and I think another word that we could use is a shortened version of rightness, which is rights, individual rights, the right to feel however you feel about something, the right to think about however you think about it. And so when an IP has the fixation of rightness, meaning that they have these rights, the challenge is that when you go out into the world, and all IPs are developing their auxiliary of an extroverted perceiving function, of extroverted intuition or exploration for the INPs, and extroverted sensing or sensation for the ISPs. When you go out into the world and you're learning there, right, because the perceiving functions are more about information gathering and learning, you learn that your rights don't always matter that much to the outside world, and also how wrong you often are. Like you're calibrating to the experience you've had up until this moment. Your rights and your rightness is about whatever you've currently experienced and whatever that, whatever wisdom currently lives inside. But if you stop taking in information, that rightness, that wisdom gets stagnant. And so you have to perpetually be taking in new information in order to even have a shot at being right about anything. The more limited your information, the more limited your experience, the less likely you are to be right. But that said, when you go out into the world and expose yourself to all of these different things, right? The reality is of the situation for extroverted sensing or sensation, or the possibilities of how things could go with extroverted intuition or exploration. The more you expose yourself to all of this, the more likely you are to be rooted in how reality actually works or how things could actually operate. So there's this sense that if I expose myself to all these thoughts, I'm going to realize how wrong I am. While at the same time, if I expose myself to these things, I'm more likely to be right in the long run. And so that's a really that can be a very uncomfortable process. And if an IP is very sort of fixated on their rights as well, because when you go out into the world and you say, well, this is how I feel about it, and the world says, I don't really care. and you're like, well, but you should care because I have a right to feel this way. And oftentimes the world goes, well, okay, you have a right to feel that way, but that doesn't mean that you're right. You have a right to it, but that doesn't mean you're right. That's a really tough moment. That said, a lot of IPs have done a lot of work around extroverted intuition or extroverted sensing. They've done a lot of exploration in the outside world, but the nuances aren't just of recognizing that you can be wrong. It's recognizing that the outside world's sort of how it's operating and set up versus how you feel internally. There's a bridge between those two things. You still have a right to feel however you want to feel, or you still have a right to think however, whatever makes sense to you. By the same token, that's not really going to have any impact on the outside world unless you also recognize that the outside world is operating very differently than your internal landscape. And so one of the ways a person can develop that auxiliary function in a more fine-grained, nuanced ways is building a bridge between those two worlds, figuring out how to bring what's important to you internally in a way that you're not just impacted by the outside world, but you're also having an impact on the outside world. And I think that those two things can be that's the eternal work of the IP. That's why you never can let go of getting that information in through your extroverted perceiving function of that co-pilot. Even if you've done a lot of work there, there's still always more to do because there's more information to take in.
When an IP goes into the world and they start to use that extroverted perceiving process, the concern is that your individual way of seeing things won't be honored as much. So the core fear, just like for EPs, we talked about this idea of, oh man, I'll be accountable if I start to use my introverted judging function. And for IJs, it's I will create these expectations for myself. For IPs, it's I might be marginalized. If I go out in the world, I might show up and be marginalized for the things that I believe and think. I can't abide that. That's not going to be cool for me. So there's a concern or a fear of marginalization that comes up for you that you resist going in the outer world around. And I would argue, just like the other two categories we talked about, it's counterintuitive. The more you put yourself into the outer world and you take in either through extroverted sensing, sensation, or extroverted intuition, exploration, you actually are less likely to be marginalized because you're taking in more territory. With extroverted sensing, if you're an ISP, you are basically taking in the reality of the situation, what is real here and now. You're not necessarily inventing something and convincing yourself it's right. You're actually taking in real life feedback of the here and now. If you're using the pattern recognition of extroverted intuition or exploration, you're making patterns. And so the viewpoints that you have inside of yourself, whether you're an ITP or an IFP, either using introverted thinking or introverted feeling, those things are going to be higher calibrated. They're going to be less likely to be marginalized by the outer world because you're taking in the outer world as a consideration for the things you think or believe. So it's only going to get better, and the likelihood of you being marginalized is less if you put yourself out there, not more.
Yeah, and as an ISP, you become more realistic. And as an INP, you take in, you see the bigger picture. And so for both of those, the communication, it will change you. I think that's the other challenge that IPs have, is that they know that when they take in information from the outside world, it's going to, by definition, change who they are. That information will now have to be taken into consideration. For ITPs, it means it's going to their thoughts and how they see the world and the way they think about things will change. For an IFP, how they feel about things and how they see themselves and their identity will change. So for IPs, new information is an identity shift. And that means that, well, was I not right to begin with? Because my identity had to basically be dissolved and restructured with all of this new information I took in. So was I not right to begin with? And that firm fixation, by the way, is the attachment to being right. But if you see it more like you do have rights to feel and think however you want to, and those rights are never taken, your rightness about something might have changed and altered, and you might not have been right to begin with, but you still have rights to feel and think how you want to. And those rights are, like you mentioned, Joel, are more honored by the outside world if the way you're showing up, it has that bridge, is resonating with the outside world as well, is taking the outside world into consideration as well. And so I think that the challenge of development, even in a nuanced way, right? Because if a IP has done quite a bit of development here, there's always more patterns to make, and the world is always changing and shifting, and you have to keep up with how it actually is, right? And so even in a nuanced way, it's really important to keep remembering that being right is actually, it's actually a fantasy. Just like for EPs, that whole concept of freedom, that's a fantasy. We are always going to be obligated to something, right? We're never going to be 100% free. For IJs, that sense of invulnerability, that's a fantasy. It doesn't matter what we've built. We're always going to be vulnerable to something. And to IPs, being right is a fantasy because none of us actually know how reality truly works. We're just all kind of making it up as we go. So all of these fixations are fundamentally fantasies. And you can get closer to experiencing the fantasy of your desire by developing that auxiliary function and making sure you're never letting go of that, making sure you're never going, well, I've done enough work in that, I can move on. Yeah, you can move on and also juggle other personality development. Again, eventually get to a point where you're balancing out your auxiliary and tertiary or co-pilot and 10-year-old, and you're incorporating that inferior function. We even talked about John Beebe's model of the 6 function, that one being a very interesting one to start developing. And you can start juggling all of that stuff too, and never lose sight of the power of that auxiliary function. Your firm fixation will resist it. It will feel like a seeming contradiction, but it's actually the thing that facilitates you getting closer to what your firm fixation wants.
Let's move on to EJs, extroverted judging types. This is the M in firm, which stands for management. ENFJs, ENTJs, ESFJs, ESTJs. And these types are interested in managing the outer world, whether that's the relationships in the outer world, EFJs are more interested in that, or the structures and the resource of the outer world, which ETJs are very interested in managing.
And so the auxiliary function for all the EJ types, for ETJs, for ESJs, it would be introverted sensing or memory. For ENJs, it would be introverted intuition or perspectives. And the challenge that EJs have when they are developing the auxiliary or co-pilot function, the reason why there's like a seeming incongruity between those two things is when you go inside, and that's where your questions live, there is by definition a sense of uncertainty that lives there. There's a lot of internal questions you have about what's going on for you and what's going on for other people. When EJs are fixated on management, and the reason why we use the word management, not say control, is because ultimately all of the fixations are about control. They just want control in a different way. Management is specifically about knowing what should be done in the outside world and implementing or getting other people to implement this. And there's a sense of certainty that must come along with that. There's a sense of I know best. I know how this should be happening. I know how other people should be operating. I know how all of these things should be panning out. And so I'm going to sort of push onto the world my sense of how things should be happening. When you go inside and start questioning what's going on inside your mind, or when you start questioning what's going on inside other people's minds, it robs you of that sense of certainty, or at least it does momentarily as you're exploring what's happening internally for you. For introverted intuition or perspectives, it's what's happening for other people's minds. Like, what's the pattern of what's going on for me and what's going on for other people? You spend a moment questioning what's happening for someone else, and it immediately makes you question whether or not you are right in your assertion that you know what's best for others. Because now you're actually asking how they're experiencing it. If you give a command to somebody else and you're then trying to figure out how they're experiencing your command, it can be a little unsettling and go, well, maybe I shouldn't be telling everybody what to do. If you go inside for introverted sensing or memory, you get you instinctively understand how people's experiences have crafted who they are. And so you start to know how important each experience is for the individual. You start to understand how whatever you're implementing now is creating a precedent that might be forever. And so again, it can be a little undermining in the sense of I know what's best, because now you're really honestly and authentically asking, what's this going to do to people? What's the implications of my behavior? What's the long-term benefits or damage of what I'm doing right now? And it's much easier to just blitz through those questions and just go straight into action, which is what EJs have a tendency to do.
So taking that idea of wanting to go directly into action, and we can just, again, look at this pattern again. EPs fear going to their co-pilot because of accountability reasons. IJs, it's about setting up expectations. For IPs, it's about feeling marginalized or, not taken seriously maybe in the outer world. And for EJs, it's a sense of uncertainty. It removes the ability for action or management, and you feel almost impotent in the world if you feel uncertain. So the fear is that by getting internal, shifting perspectives, or getting in touch with what's come before, you're going to undermine your ability to execute in the outer world, and that makes you feel very uncertain.
Yeah, the challenge with all of these is the fear is that you'll get lost there. For EPs, you're handing yourself over to something else that's going to force you to make choices that will get you stuck there. For IJs, the sense is that you're going to expose yourself to destruction of some sort. For IPs, it's a sense that you'll lose yourself, right? Like you will no longer be able to rest into your identity. And for EJs, it's a fear that you're going to get lost in this perpetual questioning. So the fear is that the auxiliary function on some level robs you of your strength. It robs you of the thing that you were meant to do, or at least that's sort of the underlying instinct. But it's all counterintuitive. If you go into your introverted perceiving function as an EJ, you actually have so much more power in leadership because you are taking other people into consideration. You are thinking about the long-term implications. You are taking into account how this is going to craft and mold somebody in perpetuity and what the end of this road is. And because of that, other people instinctively follow you. They don't see you as a despot. They don't see you tyrannical. They don't want to reject your leadership qualities. They actually rest into you and are more likely to hand that power over to you.
Well, it's this idea of overplaying your hand. When you're an EJ that's not checking in and not touching base with what's the perspective or the precedent, you tend to overplay your hand aggressively, maybe. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but you're overplaying it. And when you check in and you play your hand, people go, okay, he or she thought about this hand they're playing. It's not something they're just doing out of autoresponder or out of soundbite. This is something they've mindfully executed on. So the cards they're laying on the table have been carefully selected, not just played out quickly. I think that's the key there. That's that counterintuitive thing, right?
Yeah, I would say that EJs always have a sort of a feeler out or an antenna out for being undermined. And it's because you can't get anything done if you're being undermined. whether that's from people or the circumstance or the situation. They don't want an undermining energy. And the fear is that the auxiliary function, that co-pilot function, is going to be the thing that causes self-undermining. And so there's an instinct to avoid it. Then they go into their tertiary or 10-year-old, which gets them back into action. And then they just have to navigate through. They just have to figure out how to improvise their way through. And I think that there is a sense that when you go inside yourself and question yourself, it can feel undermining. But I feel like it's less about experiencing that as an undermining energy than as measuring twice and cutting once. This is that part of the EJ. To go inside and have a moment of self-questioning and to really think about things and their implications is how you make sure that you don't get yourself into messes later. How you make sure that you don't get yourself into a situation where you're actually just creating more management work for yourself because you're starting fires now that you have to put out. And so what's interesting is, just as with all of it, it's counterintuitive that if you don't go into that auxiliary function of the introverted perceiving function, that's actually what's going to undermine you. Your behavior ends up becoming the undermining energy as opposed to the questions that become the undermining energy. And again, if you feel you've done as an EJ a lot of work here, you feel you've done your sufficient co-pilot introverted intuition perspectives or introverted sensing memory work, even if you've decided to move on and you're doing some of the other personality development work that is the next phase, you still always have to keep your finger on the pulse of this auxiliary function, just like all the types do. And that is making sure you're fueling your mind with more information about how people are experiencing things, more information about precedents that are set, more information of seeking expert guidance and learning from the mistakes of the past. If you're using introverted sensing or memory, that's going inside and reviewing what you've experienced, maybe journaling, and then allowing yourself to understand the implications of that behavior, how it could be done better, some of the possibilities around that, right? Of course, that will pull in the other side of the polarity, which we've talked about before. So really giving yourself time, always setting aside time to make sure you're going internally for that. And then the same thing is for E and Js, right? The same principle applies. Feeding your mind on information about how other people experience things or how things tend to pan out. Giving yourself a lot of opportunities to read high quality content and to read other people's, what other people's experiences are and maybe sort of the psychological components of how everything is panning out. The more you're doing that, the more patterning you're doing and the more review you're doing, the higher quality all of your leadership becomes. Now, that's not to say that all EJs are necessarily in a position of leadership formally, but I think all EJs put themselves in a position of management, whether even that's just themselves, managing themselves, managing one person. You're still going to need this high quality information to know how to ask the right questions. Think of this auxiliary function as the one that teaches you how to ask the right questions. So when you're managing, you're giving the quote unquote right answers as you're implementing in the outside world. Anytime you implement in the outside world, the stakes go up because now you're talking to other people. Now you're engaging with the reality around you and you're having an impact in the world outside of yourself. So in some ways, EJs have a responsibility to get inside and ask themselves the right questions because they're the most likely to be assertive about their implementation and their impact. So it's incredibly important that no matter where you're at in your personality development as an EJ, that you're still keeping, again, I'm using the phrase, keeping your finger on the pulse of perpetually developing that auxiliary or co-pilot function.
So we've been talking about this tension point between your firm fixation and growing your co-pilot or auxiliary cognitive function in your car model or cognitive function stack. And that tension point is something that we wrestle with, all of us wrestle with, and it's good just to be aware of it. We've talked a lot about grow your co-pilot, grow your auxiliary. It's really the great place to start. And then after that, we've talked about balancing your 10-year-old or tertiary with that and supporting. And then we've talked about the other parts of the car model, basically, how to think in terms of your inferior and the aspirations it brings, all the different elements of who you are. and understand that this fixation you have in the firm model structure is going to almost be at odds with your personal growth sometimes, or it'll feel like it's at odds. It actually isn't. In fact, counterintuitively, we've been saying through this this podcast here that counterintuitively, growing your co-pilot will actually get you closer to your fixation of what your ideal is in the firm fixation more than not growing. Like avoiding the growth there, it feels like it's going to be honoring that idealism you bring, but counterintuitively, it actually helps you go more toward that idealism in your life and your personal growth journey.
I think sometimes when people claim to have sufficient auxiliary or co-pilot development, they don't know that it's actually their firm fixation that's trying to avoid that work. They don't know that. We all want to see ourselves as further along than we actually are. It's so hard to be modest in our development and growth. It's so hard to be really accurate about where we're at. And so we can trick ourselves. We can fool ourselves into believing we're further along than we actually are without knowing that we're serving the agenda of that firm fixation, wanting us to believe that we're someplace where we're not. And so we default to the firm fixation. We default to indulging it. And I think always recognizing that auxiliary or co-pilot function is going to be the toughest one for us to master, and it's the highest leverage. So my recommendation is no matter how far along you are in your growth and development, no matter how sophisticated you are, always keep that auxiliary or co-pilot function, always keep it top of mind. Have some vigilance around ways and opportunities that you can always be refining it. It's never complete. It's never done. It's never sufficient. You can get to a place where it's, maybe sufficient for the thing you're trying to do, but it's a lifelong process, right? The journey is the point. And that auxiliary co-pilot is your travel partner. It's your buddy the whole way through. It's something that always needs attention. It always needs nourishment. It always needs opportunities to become better. And if you do that, then it will be a very loyal travel companion. It will help you get to where you want to go.
Well, it is the co-pilot of your life. I mean, that word really resonates there. It's the co-pilot that helps you with the navigation of the journey that you're on as an individual. All right, now it's your turn. You need to come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this show, you need to leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story about some of the things that are coming up for you as we talk about this today. Again, you can do that at personalityhacker.com, directly below this episode. We want to hear from you. We want you to come over and make your voice known.
And of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Leaving a rating and review on iTunes is something that delights us. So if you would do that for us, we'd be very grateful. Our book is out. It's called Personality Hacker. Go check it out at all major book retailers. And if you'd like to leave a rating and review for the book on Amazon or Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
We got a message in recently. Somebody said, I've been listening to your podcast for, I think, years. And I had no idea you guys had programs that you developed for personal growth. And they went to our website and they saw. So we must not make that known on the podcast very much. We didn't think about it. But we have a ton of programs designed specifically to help you grow yourself using typology and other models of human development. So if you go to personalityhacker.com, you can browse the catalog there, various topics, and particularly if you're interested in growing the co-pilot and growing your personality, we have a lot of materials for each of the personality types. We've got free articles and resources and multiple podcasts, but we also have premium programs. So we didn't even realize you may not have been aware of that. So we thought we'd mention it today to let you know that that's available to you. And if you're interested, head over there and check out some of those resources.
Well, and that also helps subsidize the podcast.
Yeah, we don't advertise on this podcast. So that's the way we generate and make all this happen and work.
Yeah. So if you would like to support us and also get the benefit of investing in yourself, go check out the catalog.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.